nation. The hobby is the people. Weekly news and interviews. It's your number one source. Sports Card Nation. The hobby is the people. Sports Card Nation.
This is Sports Card Nation.
What is up? Episode 285, Sports Card Nation. Happy to be back with you. Also, a little extra happy for those that may or may not know. I had to take some college courses for my teaching certificate. I had to get some more credit, so I signed up for some online college courses. I took 3 in one semester. Not kind of a mistake on my part as far as time-wise. Kind of chewed up a lot of my free and extra time, but I survived. I made it, and I'm happy to report I passed. And let me put it this way: I did better than I did in high school. Got a 99 in communications, a 94 in world history, and a 92 in business law. And we'll have to do it again in a year or two, but next time I do it, I'm going to do 1 course per semester rather than 3. But static to be done. You know, I'm going to pat myself on the back. Proud of myself for getting it done and doing as well as I did. But that's not what we're here to talk about today. Great guest, Steve Wiegand, author, has wrote, I think, 11 books. His latest one is titled The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell, a tale of baseball cards, average players, and the true value of America's game. Read the book. I got a advanced copy. I was so honored to get to read it ahead of time, about 350 pages. And it's about Danny O'Connell, sort of a role player in the 50s and 60s. Had a couple really decent years. Very smart, intelligent player. And when I first, when Steve first approached me about reading the book and giving my assessment of it, I was a little nervous, or maybe nervous, not a little apprehensive. Danny O'Connell, sort of I don't want to say unknown, but kind of in the great space of things, not widely known. And I'm like, how do you do a book on, sort of a role player? And let me tell you something. This is not a shill or a commercial. This book was terrific. It wasn't just Danny O'Connell. There's baseball card stories. There's baseball stories. There's some behind the scenes of America's pastime. And I read this book quickly. I'm not a voracious reader, but I went through this book in under 2 weeks while working full time doing content creation. And it's going to be in my bookshelf. It's kind of a book, like in a few years, I'd probably read it again. And I highly recommend, if you're a fan of baseball, some of the behind the scenes, like I said, there's baseball cards in the book as well. So highly recommend. And we're going to talk about the book and Danny O'Connell on today's episode with Steve Wiegand. So with that being said, quick commercial break, and we're back with Steve.
Iron Sports Cards is your #1 source for all your PSA and other grading submissions. Their elite status improves turnaround times. Heck, they even provide the card savers. Their chat rooms provide updates on all your submissions. They also offer wax options and single cards to cover all the bases. Check them out on Facebook at Iron Sports Cards Group or on the web at ironsportscards.com, or even give them a call at 1-877-IRON-PSA. Rob's got you covered.
Happy to have my next guest on the Sports Card Shop guest line. He's the author. We're going to talk about a specific book, but this is not his first book. He's the author of 1876, Year of the Gun, The Dancer, The Dreamers, The Queen of Romania, The American Revolution for Dummies, U.S. History for Dummies, and the book we're going to talk about, The Uncommon Life of Danny O'Connell. And I probably left out a book, but let's get him on. He can tell me if I missed one. Mr. Steve Wiegand. How are you?
Hi, John. How you doing?
Good. So like I said, this is not your first book, the Danny O'Connell book that we're going to talk about. Everyone thinks it's easy to write a book. Obviously, you're, I guess, a veteran, we'll say, of book writing.
That means I'm old.
Well, I'm with you and probably catching up just the same as well. Talk about as an author, the process and, how do you, not even just, we'll talk about this book, but even like coming up with what you want to write about, kind of that put that hat on in the process.
Okay. Well, I kind of eased into writing books because I was a newspaper reporter and columnist for about 100 years. And I covered everything from mass murders to politics to World Series. And so when you're writing for a newspaper, obviously you're writing on a deadline all the time. And so you got to learn to put things together, and you're also limited in space that you have. The editor tells you you got 35 inches, column inches in a paper. This is back now. I should say for your younger viewers and listeners, newspapers were these things that came out and they were printed on paper, and they came out every day most of the time. And they're like dinosaurs. But anyway, that's how I got into writing. And so I started writing I wrote my first book, I want to say 25 years ago, and kind of fell into, somebody said, you want to do a book on this? Or I had an idea for another book. So the Danny O'Connell book is my 10th, and I'm currently working on my 11th and 12th right now. So in answer to your question about how you the process, it's totally different for everybody. It's what everybody's comfortable with. It depends on whether you're writing nonfiction or fiction. I've written all nonfiction. I've never written a novel until that's what I'm doing right now, is writing my first novel. It's a totally different experience. I don't have a clue what I'm doing. I'm spending a lot more time rewriting than I ever have before. So it really depends on how you want to approach it and what the topic is. If it's something like Danny O'Connell's story, I wanted to do three things with it. One, I wanted to tell the story of this common baseball player. In the parlance of cards, he's a common. They go for his 1960 card goes for $3, and that's if it's in, PSA 10 or something probably. So for him, it was easy because it's a biography. He was born, he went through his life, and he died. And then I tried to weave into it two other things. One was the history of the United States, what was going on in the country while he was alive. And two, sort of a little bit of sort of a brief background of baseball cards, because that's how I found out about this guy.
Yeah, and you do a great job. And obviously I read the book. You let me have an advance copy. Thank you. It was hard to put down. I joked with you before we started recording. I'm in the process of taking 3 college courses for my employment as a teaching assistant to get my next certificate. And there were many a night, I think it only took me a week to 10 days, to read. And like I said, I'm not a voracious reader all the time, but, I was debating, like, do my coursework or keep reading. And you just, like you said, you really put all of the elements together. What was going on in the world, the life of Danny O'Connell, Major League Baseball in general, a lot of great stories that kind of centered around him, but not necessarily always just about him. And then obviously the history of baseball cards. And you did a great job with it. I guess, the first question that I think many would have, like you mentioned, he wasn't a heralded player. We're going to talk about that too, because he was definitely a scrappy guy, had some good years, was in demand for a good portion of his career, the way he played the game and being an intelligent ball player. But what was it? Why Danny O'Connell? I think some people will ask.
I think that's a good question. And I think every card collector, I don't care when they started or how old they are, can relate to this. I did Danny O'Connell because when I was 9 going on 10 years old and collecting baseball cards, I hated Danny O'Connell. And the reason I hated Danny O'Connell was because I was a diehard Giants fan, still am. Would go to the liquor store by my house every week. I got my allowance. I'd go up there and buy my nickel packs. I'd open them up. I never got Willie Mays. I never got Orlando Cepeda. I never got anybody that I'd ever heard of. I got Danny O'Connell cards. And I must have had, I don't know, by the end of the season, I had 24 Danny O'Connell cards. And then I found out much later that the year that I was collecting, this was 1960, he wasn't even playing for the Giants. He'd been cut in spring training and played the whole year in the minor leagues. So fast forward to, I was a baseball card collector as a kid and have all the usual stories about putting cards in spokes and flipping them and doing all that. And I want to say about 4 or 5 years ago, I was reading a story in the New York Times about the wave, the pandemic wave, where cards prices just went crazy and how much they were going for. So I got curious. So I looked up Danny O'Connell cards on eBay. There was a 1958 Danny O'Connell card being sold for $28,000. It was a PSA 10. It was 58. It was a nice card, but so I got to thinking, I never knew anything about the guy. So I started looking at his statistics. And his lifetime statistics were, he played 10 years in the big leagues. He had 260. He had 39 home runs, a little over 1,000 hits. So I'm thinking, he's a common. He's an average player. Then I started looking a little bit more at the bigger numbers. And for instance, he was born in 1929. There were 1 million boys born in America in 1929. 93 of them made the major leagues for even just a little bit. He played for 10 years. So you look at the odds of just making it to the big leagues. Then he played longer than 93% of all the players that have ever played baseball since 1876 at the major league level. He had 1,000 hits, which was more than 90% of all the players that ever played. So the guy, when you look at 260 lifetime average and 39 home runs, who cares? But I got to thinking that that's the kind of guy that makes up 20 of every 26 players on the teams even today. So I got curious about his life. I started looking at his career, where he came from and how he played in the majors and how he got up to the majors, or how he played in the minors and got up to the majors, and kind of went from there. And that reinvigorated my interest in cards in general. So I started looking at cards, the history of cards, and then I've written history books in the past, so I had some grounding in that. So I wanted to throw that in as an element as well. So that's kind of where the idea came from.
Well, like I said, you did a great job and some great points there, right? Sometimes we look at those surface stats, or the big three, as they say, average, homers, ribbies, and if those don't knock your socks off, we sort of dismiss the player. But you brought up some stats there, Steve, of this guy played 10 years because of some of the other stuff and intangibles.
Exactly.
Having something between the ears. If you read the book, you learn that he was, very respected as far as intelligent and being smart in the field, at the plate, and that sort of thing. And, it's refreshing too, because there's, plenty of books, like you said, Mickey Mantle, Willie Mays, Ted Williams, and those, like, first ballot Hall of Famers, and deservedly so. I'm not,
right,
besmirching them. But I think sometimes we forget about, like, there is no baseball without that whole roster, right? And he was an integral part of the teams he played on. And like you said, lasted double-digit years, got his pension just barely. He kind of
just barely,
under the final bell. Tragic story too. He died very young, but and the other thing we sometimes don't remember is, everybody that makes, like you said, very few people make the major leagues at any professional sport. And then specifically baseball, most of the people that make Major League Baseball were not everyone, but a good percentage were multi-sport athletes
right.
in high school, and probably one of the best, if not the best athlete in their high school. So while it doesn't always translate to exact success on the major league or professional level, these guys can play even before that. And so, and they love the sport. In this particular era, as many know nowadays, right? The salaries weren't what we see today. Many had jobs in the off season. That's illustrated in the book as well. Like you couldn't take the off season off. They had families, they had to work. Many had. Right. When the season ended, they went to their next job until it was spring training. Nowadays, athletes don't have to do that. They're paid handsomely. They might have to train all year and do, training programs, but they don't have to sell insurance or that sort of thing to get by. And it was a different time in baseball, and I think the book does a great job of highlighting that and getting those behind the scenes and putting that picture together for those that may not even realize it, or sometimes even when we realize it, we forget. We need that reminder.
Time for a quick break, but we'll be right back.
For nearly 50 years, Sports Collectors Digest has been the voice of the hobby, bringing you comprehensive coverage of the sports collectible industry. From industry news, auction results, market analysis, and in-depth stories about collectors and their collections, Sports Collectors Digest has everything you need to know about the hobby. SCD is also your leading source for listings of sports collectible dealers, card shops, card shows, and the latest from the industry's top companies. To check out all the latest news or to subscribe to the hobby's oldest magazine, visit sportscollectorsdigest.com or call 1-800-829-5561.
Thanks for sticking with us. Let's return to the show.
From this era, player-wise, there's a lot of guys that are unfortunately, passing on. They're getting older. Was it difficult to get some of the background? Obviously, he had passed on, as I mentioned, tragically young. Was it hard to find people who could share stories or tell a little bit about the man, Danny O'Connell?
It was, excuse me, in terms of his teammates, yeah, it was, because most of them were gone. I talked to one or two. I talked to Dick Grote, who is a great shortstop for the Pirates in the 60s, an MVP in 1960. I talked to Carl Erskine, who just recently died, who pitched against him. He had 4 children, and all 4 of them are alive and healthy. And I talked to them, and they were a great source of people that talked to from his boyhood, or that remembered people from his boyhood. And then a lot of it was just digging through newspaper after newspaper after newspaper and looking at box scores and looking at game day stories and doing all that kind of work in the background as well. So, and then from there you could pick pieces and go and ask other questions. And then I spent about a week at the Hall of Fame in Cooperstown going through their files. And so that was very helpful as well.
The people that you did talk to, you mentioned Carl Erskine and Dick Grote, and obviously the family. Were they surprised by the subject? Like, why our dad or why O'Connell on the players' side of the thing? Did you get that sort of reaction?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. The players, I'll tell you a story. I was at the National Card Show in New Jersey in, I guess that was 2022. And I was looking for commons. I was looking for a Danny O'Connell card, and nobody was selling. Everything was graded. Everything was Eddie Matthews or Mickey Mantle or Hank Aaron. And I finally found this dealer from Cleveland who had he had a bunch of commons, and they were really good shape for every year, and he had them numbered by set. So I dug through and I found the Danny O'Connell card, and he wanted $3 for it. And I said, sure. And then he said, what do you want this for? He said, you collecting 60s, because it was a 1960 card. And I said, no, I'm doing a book. I'm writing a book on this guy. And he looked at the card, and he looked at the back, and he looked at the front, and he looked at the back again. So you're doing a book on this guy? And I explained a little bit about it. And he said, well, good luck with that. And he gave me the card for $250. So,
there you go.
To answer your question, that was, the family, when I first contacted the family, I wrote them letters after I had tracked them down and told them what I wanted to do. And it took a while for them to get back to me. And finally, the eldest son, who's also named Danny O'Connell, wrote me back and said, yeah, he'd be glad to meet with me and talk a little bit. And once I'd met him, the barriers kind of came down and the family warmed up, and they were just absolutely terrific. I went to interview them in New Jersey and New York, where they were living, in Delaware, and they couldn't have been nicer. Very helpful with scrapbooks and pictures and other things. So, but to answer your original question, yeah, it was tough sell to say I want to do a book on an average guy who never played in the World Series, never made an All-Star team, never led the league in anything in particular, but that's why I wanted to do the book in the first place, because he's more symbolic or emblematic of the players from the 1950s than Mays or Mantle or anybody else, because their stories.
Yeah, and I agree. And he was a great fielder. I mean, he, the book illustrates like he was in demand for his fielding along with Red Chandi's. Mm-hmm. And there's a connection there. And so he was, while the numbers weren't Hall of Fame worthy, he was what a lot of teams sort of look for. There were some years, as the book illustrates, where the hope was there and he didn't live up, necessarily to the hope for that season and whatnot. But he had some other years where he was the word that comes to me, and you can tell me if it kind of a spark plug kind of player.
Absolutely. He was a guy who you make a really good point, and I was going to bring this up. If he were playing today, that was another question I got. Would he make it today if he were playing today? And that's always a tough. Would Babe Ruth make it today? That's a tough question. But he did have one thing and it goes with your spark plug idea, and that he came up as a third baseman. He was an excellent third baseman. He was considered by some people the best third baseman in the league in fielding when he came up. His first year back, he was a rookie, played third base for the Pirates, which was an awful team. Got drafted, spent 2 years in the Army, came back to the Pirates. They made him a shortstop. His last year in the minor leagues, he was a shortstop. They bring him up to the big leagues to play shortstop. Halfway through his rookie season, his second year, they move him back to third base. He comes in for his third year. They move him to second base, and which is where he played most of his career. So in getting back to whether he can make it today, that there's so much emphasis today and so much value put on players that can play multi positions, that can play center field and play second base too. And he could play. He played first base. He pitched in a game as a mop-up when they didn't do that in those days. And like what you said about his spark plug, this is a guy who he would pitch batting practice. He was a bench jockey, so he would needle. He was the leading guy to needle the other team, but they liked him because he was funny. He would play any position they told him to play. He'd pinch hit, he'd pinch run, and he had just enough skill at different levels that trying 110% plus doing that kept him in the big leagues.
Yeah, versatility, right? Those guys today I think there's less of it. And the guys that still do it today, that's why they stick around. They don't have to necessarily bat 300, like he used to. So, and the book illustrates like teams inquired about him, other teams like, hey, we'd like to trade for him when he was, a free agent or available. He had times where he had to pick of a team or two where he wanted to sort of play. And that's, he was an intelligent, he had something between his ears as the book illustrated, and other people talked about that. And, had he not died at a young age, I'm sure it sounded like he was on a track to be a coach and manager, at least in the minors, which he did, I believe. Uh-huh. And then I think eventually would have probably made his way onto the big league level.
That was an interesting point, because at the end of his career, he ended his career with the Washington Senators, who in 1962, and they were an expansion team then. And they said, "Look, Danny, you're a smart guy, as you said." He was the kind of player, by the way, who did the hidden ball trick. He was the guy who would drop a soft line drive and get a double play and get around the infield fly rule. That's the kind of things he used to do. He scored from second base one time. He was playing with the Giants. Willie Mays hit a ground ball to the first baseman, who threw it to the pitcher. The pitcher turned his back on the plate, and O'Connell scored from second base, and he wasn't a speedster either. So he would do those kind of things. But getting back to his coaching, he became a manager of a minor league team for the Senators. Then he got called up by Gil Hodges when Hodges took over the Senators and became a coach for a couple of years. But the trouble with being a coach in those days was he didn't make any money. And he could make more money finding a job in his hometown of Paterson, New Jersey, than he could being a coach for the Washington Senators. So he quit. He became a coach. Well, you fast forward a few years to 1969, and Hodges is the manager of the Mets. And Don Zimmer, who is a good friend of O'Connell's, came to the O'Connell house and talked to him a little bit about coming back. So there was always among the O'Connell family, they always wondered if he'd lived, would he have ended up with the Mets coaching staff and been part of that miracle Mets team of '69. So, but he was a baseball smart guy. Leo DeRocher once said he'd win far more games with his head than with his bat. So,
well, listen, any way you do it, right?
Right.
You get it done. You mentioned like he wasn't the fastest guy, but he was a hustler. Someone falls asleep at the wheel, he was going to take advantage of the situation. And
Right.
that kind of play impresses your fellow ball player.
Yeah.
Okay, he's not the most talented guy on the field, but he makes up for that with the hustle, with the banter, like you said, with kind of needling the other team. Like he does it in different ways. Stuff that doesn't always appear on a stat sheet. It's not necessarily measurable by just reading the back of a baseball card, as that dealer did when you inquired about purchasing that card, and he questioned, like, really, this guy? But it's that other stuff that you don't always see by reading stats, or unless you really watched him play on a day in, day out sort of basis. And those guys, those guys still exist even today. But I think it's harder. Might be even harder today because of all the emphasis put on like war and all these new stats that we didn't even have in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and even 80s. War and all these other newfangled stats that statisticians have sort of weaved together. And he made a career of that. Being a hustler, being smart, and got his pension, and then like you said, he started his coaching career with Washington, and then died tragically in a car accident. You mentioned his hometown of Paterson, New Jersey. I know there's other athletes have come from that city. He's not the only one.
Right.
Has the city, is he still known there, or is it kind of, as time has marched on, he's kind of a forgotten son? Where does he stand in the Paterson?
He's been pretty much forgotten. After he died in 1969 in like you said, in a car crash. He had a heart attack while he was coming back from a baseball banquet and ran into a pole. And he actually died of the heart attack, the accident, but he was only 40. In the years right after he died, there was a city Little League park that was named after him. There was a plaque put in. But the demographics of Paterson have changed amazingly, where it's now predominantly, there's a very large population from the Middle East. There's a very large population from Central and South America. And I went to his boyhood home and kind of walked up and down the street and asked people if they knew who he was. Nobody did. But several of the younger people there said, well, we don't play baseball, we play soccer. And so that part of it had died away in terms of his immediate home. Now in New Jersey, he's still, well known among the pantheon of New Jersey athletes. So that's a little different. But no, he's pretty much recognized as much as any average common player from the 50s is. If he were from a small town, a very small town like, in Iowa someplace, they'd probably have a statue of him in the park. But better than I do, being from the East, that New Jersey is one big megalopolis for the most part. And so he's not really remembered very well.
Yeah, the one thing, if you read the book, and I encourage everyone to do so, it's a great book. Do it for this week's portion of this conversation. I want to thank Steve for coming on. If you haven't, the book's not out just yet, but check it out. We're going to talk more about it next week as well. So a very important time in baseball history, card history, and Steve does a great job with this book and covering it. And we'll talk more next week to him as well. Now we're going to hear from our Hobby is the People announcer of the week. If you'd like to do it, listen to the promo, how to get yourself on the air, if you will, and we'll come back with some closing thoughts after that.
Time for our Hobby is the People announcer of the week.
This is Mike, This Baseball Card Life, and remember, the hobby is the people.
If you'd like to be the Hobby is the People announcer of the week, do a WAV or MP3 file and send it to sportscardnationpc@gmail.com.
That's a wrap for this week. Huge thanks to you, the listeners out there, because without you, there is no us. If you like the show, we truly appreciate positive reviews. Big ups to our great guests who drive the show and our awesome sponsors who make it all possible. Sports Card Nation will be back next week, but don't forget to catch either Hobby Quick Hits or Card Mentions coming up on Monday. I'll leave you with this. How do we change the world? One random act of kindness at a time. Remember, the hobby is the people.
Hobby Hotline is the hobby's only live interactive call-in show. Join some of your favorite hobby personalities every Saturday, 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific, to discuss the hottest hobby topics. If you miss us live, catch us after the fact on all major podcast platforms. Follow us on socials at Hobby Hotline.
Hobby News Daily is your homepage of the hobby, providing original writing, exclusive gem rate data, a daily morning minute podcast, and some of the best content creators in the hobby. Remember, hobbynewsdaily.com and @Hobby News Daily on social. Happy collecting!